Welcome everyone to Plenary 3. This afternoon we're going to explore what's the core expertise of a publisher today. The subtitle of that is the buy versus build dilemma. At a time when technological development and new services have so much potential, what should we be doing as publishers? What is the core expertise of a publisher today, and should you buy or build your way to growth? Such a huge subject area deserves a view from a number of different perspectives, so the panel is chosen today to reflect this, and after their presentations we'll have a short discussion and then some questions from you. So to introduce the panel, we're going to start with Alison Jones, who's from Practical Inspiration Publishing. Alison believes that buy or build is in fact the wrong question, and she's going to share her insight on this to us all now.
Great, the slides work. It's always a relief. So, yeah, I bring, I think, a bit of an unusual perspective to this question, because for many years I worked in big publishing companies, OUP, Macmillan, and working with big systems and in-house resources, also commissioning big projects with out-of-house developers as well. And today I run a small business, a really tiny small business. It's me, basically. So I've got probably more of a spread of experience in this than anybody else in the world. And I run my business today using an infrastructure that probably didn't even exist 5 years ago. And that has been a massive learning curve for me, and I hope an interesting perspective for businesses of all sizes as well. But it's not just recently that phrase buy or build has irritated me, which is what Jon was referring to. It's just the wrong question. And it's a really good example, I think, of how language can constrain our thinking. Because if you think about these phrases, we are suckers for rhetorical devices. And those, the alliteration, those juxtaposed monosyllabic words, they stick in our brains, but they do us a disservice when they embody false dichotomies. Do or die, sink or swim, build or buy. Do you know what? There could be other options. But when you ask those questions, you shut those other options down. So building, buying, those are both great options. But there are others. There's partnership and collaboration. And I think that might be the most exciting and practical of all in this fast-changing world, because when you collaborate, that allows you to play to your core strengths, and we'll come on to core capability in a minute, and at the same time access somebody else's core strength and vice versa. And I think there's been a fundamental societal and economic change that kind of underpins this, and it's something to do with the move away from ownership towards access, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. So 100 years ago, your average society gentleman would have paid for, owned all of these products or services. And today, we kind of just pay for them as we need them, and only then. And I know you know that that's very true of library budgets as well. They're increasingly moving towards paying only for what they actually use at the time they need it. And it's the same with business systems and IT. The cloud-based systems infrastructure and the marketplace for resources that I use has utterly transformed. And I think that's often invisible to people who are working in traditional organizations. So I did a very quick audit of what I do, what I consider my core capabilities, the business activities that I own, if you like, and what I outsource in some way, either by renting the systems or the tools or the resource. I was actually quite surprised by this list, and I'm fairly pleased with it. I don't think there's much in that first column that I shouldn't be doing that isn't a core capability. There's probably still some way to go with outsourcing and collaboration, but it's not a bad start, and I think it's scalable. So I guess the question is, what would an audit of your company look like? Are the things that you're doing yourselves really core capabilities? And if you have partners, are you using those partners, your and the collaborators, and also the new tools that are out there for you in a way that's going to be most effective for you? It's interesting with this pace of development, often cloud-based tools are probably massively superior to many of the tools that we've been using in-house for years. And I find that traditional publishers tend to be really, really good at competitive strategy, not so much a collaborative strategy. And I think this is one area actually where societies and university presses have generally been much, much better, which is great for you, because I really do strongly believe that that is the most effective route to sustainable innovation today. But it only works if you develop that alongside what you do best, but you develop that new capability to integrate shared developments into your future path and to innovate continuously. So I'm going to leave you with my suggested definition of a new core capability, if you like, that every publisher needs these days. It's what you do best. There is a bit on the bottom that's fallen off, that's a shame. It's what you do best, plus the ability to integrate what you're doing into the path going forward, plus the ability to collaborate effectively with the right people, and then plus the vital bit that's missing, innovation. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Thanks very much, Alison. Chris Leonard from Emerald Group Publishing is now going to examine the issues that are raised if the question became buy and build.
Yes, good afternoon, everyone. So my name is Chris Leonard. I'm head of product at Emerald, and I have come here to address the question of build or buy, with the answer build and buy, but also have some practical examples from Emerald. So let's have a look. When we're looking at solutions, particularly for things like journal hosting, we have the option to buy, which of course is quite easy for us. It's a proven solution. We get a lot of support. The content is integrated into all the third-party feeds that it needs to go to. And of course, we keep abreast of technology and certain policies thanks to our platform provider. But if we did it all ourselves, we'd have complete control of the requirements. We could release when we wanted and how often we wanted to. And it would be unique. But the disadvantage of building. So there's always the uncertainty over when you can make a release. If you're working in a traditional publishing environment, this is much more akin to software development, so it needs a change of mindset. This third point, it may not necessarily be less expensive. It's perhaps not the best way to approach this, to think you will save money. You may save money, but you may not. And of course, it requires maintenance and uptime and everything that your customers expect. But again, if you buy, do you end up with the high street syndrome? I thought high street syndrome was a well-known phrase, but when I did a Google image search for it, I couldn't find anything, so that's an image of a high street. High street syndrome is where everything looks the same. If you go to a high street in England, you'll see they all have a Boots, a Marks and Spencer's, a Dixon's, an Abbey National, or whatever they're called these days, Santander. So you don't really know where you are, because although the streets are slightly different, they all have the same shops there. And of course, it's worth stating, as Todd Carpenter did fairly recently, if you don't control your infrastructure and your path to customers, your entire business is at the mercy of a third party. So this is a rather provocative statement. Publishing articles is a solved problem. But when you think about the services around the content, that's where we can make our users exceedingly happy. So, a quick example from Emerald. We need to know who our users are if we want to create a customized platform for them. We need to know what's valuable for us to develop on that platform. We need to see what's already available on our platform, a functional gap analysis. And then we need to do the customization. So about 3 months ago now, we did what we call a discovery phase with our users, and we asked them what they liked about our platform, what they expected from it, and the kind of things that aren't there right now. And we found out that people really don't like our interface, and they really, really don't like how the search function operates. Okay, that's fine. That's things we can fix. They like more like this, and students want free content, short summaries, and indicators of authority. Librarians wanted help with implementing their library discovery services, and there were indications that curated content was valuable to our users. Okay, so out of those things, what's valuable? So obviously they're all valuable to the users. Are they valuable to us too? Is there an ROI on us developing a service to give away more free content? We certainly want to overhaul our interface, provide shorter summaries. We're going to start developing some more open access content and a lot of other things. But as a customer on a platform, we're just one of many. And how do we get our development work prioritized? We can with some more additional investment. But we're still tied to release schedules, and our in-house staff only have limited access in terms of customizing our platform solution. So I don't know what the answer is right now. We have bought and we want to build, but we couldn't have built from scratch. But that's not to say the idea of building a journals platform from scratch isn't an option. I think in the near future, we'll be able to start from a very advanced position with some of those examples that I've listed on the slides there. But maybe there's a third way. We're looking at a distributed architecture where we can swap functionalities in and out as required, but it's dependent on having very good APIs. Some of the disruptors in STM publishing are technology leading rather than editorial, but the very interesting ones are technology-led and editorially interesting, such as the Rio Journal and Fiction and Winnower, and I'm sure there are others too. But we can learn a lot of lessons from the non-STM world as well. So when we were thinking about things like shorter summaries and more like this, rather than go to other STM publishers, we decided to look where the traffic numbers were very high, and that isn't in the STM world. It's in the real world, if you like, of the Daily Mail. So we started to look at the inspiration we got there, and the use of images and leading text inspired us, shall we say. When we look at things like iTunes, if you just do a search for a song, you can sample some free content. You have indicators of popularity, which students were very keen on for our academic articles. And you can purchase or rent. You can curate content, so you could create your own playlists and share them. You can imagine if that was a virtual journal that a user could create and share with their friends. But of course, if you over-engineer things and they don't quite work as the user expects, then that isn't very good. So we're going to be inspired outside of STM. In terms of build or buy, I think there's a third option, which is to build and buy, but it needs a lot of financial and cultural change within traditional organizations. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Chris. Lynn Miller from TBI Communications now is going to apply the marketing discipline of satisfying customer needs profitably to the question, and she believes you need to do this in order for publishers to make decisions about what they need to do rather than what they want to do.
Thanks, Jon. Hello, I'm Lynn Miller from TBI Communications. My team and I work with publishers, societies and technology providers in launching new products and services and reaching into new markets. And we also develop with them marketing campaigns to communicate with their customers. A strong focus, though, for many of the publishers that we work with is brand development and strategy. And so I wanted to share some insights from the work we do in helping those companies decide their best strategies and then helping them decide on how to execute those in the most profitable way. So TBI is a strategic consulting and marketing services agency. We're an outsourced agency, and that in itself for publishers raises questions about what they do themselves in-house or what they commission an agency for. The benefits of an outsourced agency is that they have a different, fresh insight, and they are usually outside of the political influences, internal politics, and also they can provide a more sort of honest, uncensored opinion, and they're not particularly wedded to particular outcomes. In a stable market where things are fairly constant, marketing has played a bit of a backseat, which is why for years marketing has been more about promoting academic journal content. But now publishers need more strategic support, and not everybody can afford those skills. So external agencies can be helpful there. In an uncertain and fast-moving environment, it can be easier to follow what the rest are doing, so to follow the herd, to call yourself a second-wave adopter. Everything feels safe, and nobody can criticize you because they're all doing the same. But following the herd isn't always as safe as it looks. The challenge today for publishers is to look more closely at their specific and unique opportunities. The market is fragmenting into specialist communities which need different services. It's not a one model for all anymore, and that's where the real opportunity, I think, is for publishers. What communities are they actually serving? What specifically do they need? And what reputation does a publisher already have in that community that they can develop and build a brand strategy around to help focus on what's unique and special about them? It's about building your core competencies and then delivering that with real conviction. Some of the important trends in our industry are in content marketing, so building a series of communications with your customers, providing valuable content that will ultimately drive an outcome. There's also content sharing, the shift that we're seeing towards the author as the customer and improving author services, impact and public outreach, and then knowledge mobilization, so moving knowledge into active use and making the connections between research and policy and practice. And then, of course, big data, which we had an interesting session on yesterday. Publishers need to look at addressing these things, but it's hugely complex and challenging to know what to focus on and prioritize. But strategy is about choosing what not to do. It's about being really clear on a practical strategy that works for you as a publisher, and that's about identifying your unique and your best market opportunities and then ruthlessly focusing on that. Blue ocean strategy is a strategic approach to opening new markets and creating new demand. It's not about following the herd and trying to compete with everyone else in what's termed as the red ocean, which is very often very overcrowded, and very often there are limited growth opportunities. It's instead about looking to find space to do things differently and better, and using agile approaches to reduce investment and risk of failing. Swimming in the blue ocean is about creating new markets, instead of competing in existing ones, to stand apart yet keep costs low. It's a complete world of opportunity, and I think the first step in making any decisions about what you need to do actually stems from a real return to business basics. Developing a strategy should start with an understanding of where you are now, how you're viewed in the market, what your unique attributes are, and then an appraisal of your market opportunity. So looking at understanding about where you want to get to and then gaining customer insight. So talking to thought leaders in subject, looking to engage with authors, finding out more from the funders, the policymakers and the research officers. And then actually defining on where you want to be, what services are going to be core to your particular brand and which ones are more peripheral. Focus in on some core opportunities and then use an agile approach to test new services to minimize investment and use partners to help you assess how useful or core these are going to be. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Lynn. To bring in some perspective now from a different content sector, Dietmar Schantin from the Institute for Media Strategies. He's going to talk now about his observations. He's seen how in the magazine and newspaper publishing industries, publishers have had to become not only a content provider, but also an innovator, a leader in digital media, social media, analytics and technology. He'll share his experiences with us now.
Thank you very much, Jon. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. As Jon said, I'm outside the industry in a certain way, so we have been working with the newspaper industry for the last 10 years on the topic of digital transformation. So we work globally with the publishers, small ones and also big ones. The biggest one was the Hindustan Times with 1,000 people in the newsroom. The smallest one was in Carlisle here in UK with 15. So the challenges are everywhere the same. And I would like to just show or share a few thoughts what happened there. The starting point actually is that the audience, as we all know, has changed dramatically. And they expect today, and this is not only the audience that we as a publisher serve, that it's also us, we expect easy access to relevant content all the time. We want to have it at any place, at any device. So wireless is now everywhere, hopefully, and 3G is also more or less everywhere. Unfortunately, what also in the news publishing industry is a big problem, that the audience, the customers, look for the best of breed quality. So they are not loyal anymore. If there's something out there that is better, cheaper, faster, then they go there. So the loyalty has been weaker and weaker. And they want to be actively engaged in the communication flow. That's why social media or commenting and these kind of activities are more and more important. So this broadcasting model has stopped years ago, and every publisher, every news publisher had to react in a way. And one model or one principle that many news publishers embraced was that the getting away from this mono-platform communication to a multi-platform and omni-platform even communication. And the principle is quite straightforward on paper, but it's very difficult to implement in any editorial or content generation process. So if you have the editorial content generation and you have a mobile, you have a website, you have video or TV, and you have the paper, and something happens, an event happens that you want to report about. So the first thing publishers do today is to blast it out on social media, possibly, because this is where most of their audience is. Then they put something on the website. But the important thing is that they connect it by referring to one channel from the other channel. They say, look, we have something here on the social media, come to our website. Then, basically, they get some audience-generated content, questions, remarks, comments, and a little later, possibly, because video is one of the biggest growth markets also in the news market, they produce a news flash, which is either broadcasted, cable, or at least on the website. Again, referring to this other channel. And then finally, in the evening, for the next day's paper, if it's a daily paper, they publish the print article, again with cross-referencing. Then most publications need to wait at least 24 hours, magazines 1 week, 1 month. But what the modern publishers do is they refer back to the digital and say, if you want to have updates, come to our website. Or basically use our mobile offerings, whatever. And then again, the circle continues, and the next day it's again published. So this cycle has been now one of the biggest changes in any editorial department to connect people, connect the audience on the different channels, and don't leave them alone. Because if a news publisher loses a reader, an audience, then it's very difficult to get him back. And it is more and more about not getting at the platform, this platform obsession that is with every journalist. So there are editors who say they have an erotic relationship to paper. We didn't want to get into detail when he told us this, but this very close relationship to the platform is something where every newsroom or every editorial department has big problems to think about the content, about the story, and not about the platform. So based on these changes, many new roles have appeared in the newsroom. So there would be a custom audience, sorry, not the roles, fields of expertise. Audience and customer insight is something that is one of the weakest points of the publishers in the news industry, but at the same time one of the most important points. Social media, distributed content, Facebook, mainly Apple News. These are the platforms that eat the lunch of the news publisher when it comes to advertising revenue. They don't have their own content, but they expect the publisher to provide content so that they can make money. The whole user experience, customer journey, is also, when you look at different websites, and you showed the Daily Mail website, I mean, it works, but from a usability standpoint, it is questionable. Guardian does invest far more in usability. But also this expertise becomes more and more expensive, more important. Multimedia storytelling, rich media content generation, video. It's nothing that is not in the DNA of a news publisher is to create video, to create animated graphics. Multi-platform, multi-device publishing. Copy-pasting one piece of content to the website from a print or to mobile doesn't work. The user behavior is different. Everything is different. Then also data management and analytics. We hear in the next presentation about data. This is also one of the weakest points. There's a lot of data collecting, but not a lot of data management and interpretation, and then working with the data to optimize the offerings. So these new fields of expertise obviously need technologies behind it. And on the technology side, what does a news publishing house need today? Just a selection. Multi-channel and multi-format content management systems. Sounds very easy, is one of the biggest challenges. Currently, there are not many systems out there that even remotely support what a newspaper or a news publisher should do. In average, in the news publishing industry, they are about 3 to 5 years behind the suppliers with the demands from the publishers, because they need to, of course, protect their investment and stick to old technologies. E-commerce platforms. I'm sure you have, you know about the paid content, the trend that everyone basically wants to get paid for its content. It's not only get money for it, just to get emails, or just the concept of selling content is something that is very new. Digital content is very new for publishers, and how to manage it. And everything that is more complicated than eBay or Amazon, people don't buy it. So this kind of technologies are still very much at the beginning for the news publishing industry. Performance management, user journey tracking and optimization tools. Hundreds of suppliers. So this is what, for example, when we talk about buy or build, this is nothing you build. But how to use these tools, that's the different question. And finally, also data management and business intelligence systems. The whole data management, starting from the customer data, the consumer data, to the traffic data, to the usage data, and so on, is also something where the main technology challenges are for the news publishers today and tomorrow, and they are not solved. They're very much at the beginning, and again, there are loads of systems out there, but they not really do what the news publishers would need. So what do publishers do? Some of them, they invest in tech startups and merger and acquisitions. So this would be the obvious buy solution. There are the major, as an example, Axel Springer in Germany. They heavily invest and buy new companies. Schibsted in Norway also. And Jon told me today from a book publisher, so in your field, that who bought, what was it, what did they buy? The publisher you told me before the presentation, they bought a big company today.
Oh, the Atbon Miner,
yeah. Yeah, okay, yeah. So it's also this merchant acquisition is something, if you have enough pocket money, possible. What they do is also hiring people from other industries. Because if you have a fool with a tool is still a fool. So getting the know-how, how to use this tool, how to use these technologies, how to do the right thing with the technology, how to do the right thing with the hammer and not treat it as a screwdriver. People from outside the industry are these people who know it. So Financial Times gets people from Amazon or eBay because they know how these new technologies work and can bring it together. So getting the new people in and outsourcing what is not part of the core business. We heard about it, what the core business is. So these are different approaches. Publishers are still at the very beginning. Still, they sometimes outsource core activities like sub-editing for a news publisher. They outsource it to India and then find out 6 months later that it doesn't work, so they insource it again. So this outsourcing of technology all depends on what you define as a core business. So these are the three major trends that happen there. But in summary, technology can be an enabler for the media industry, is an enabler, but the challenges to get the right technology in and also have the right people to use this technology properly are still unsolved and an ongoing story. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Dietmar. I think a different content sector, but some striking similarities in terms of the parallels. Finally, last but not least, I'm going to hand over to Timo Hannay. He's going to argue that content is content, data is data, and future publishers will view the separation of content from data very strangely. They'll think it a very, very odd practice.
Thank you. Just get set up here. Okay, we'll come to my laptop in a minute, but thank you very much, Jon. Yeah, I'd like to talk about publishers and data and something that I think publishers are largely outsourcing that perhaps they should reconsider. Lots of people have started to talk about data-driven organizations, what it means, how to create them, and why you might want to do so in the first place. But for publishers, the information that's encapsulated in data is not only a means by which we can make better decisions and increase efficiency, it's also the raw material in which we trade. So as purveyors of information and knowledge, data has, or at least ought to have, a special, particularly pertinent meaning for us as publishers. One of the most curious aspects of publishers, I think, when you look at them from the outside, is the strong distinction many of them make between content and data. I'd like to make the case that this distinction is anachronistic and wrong. Content is data, and data is content. To the information technologist, that statement is so obvious as to be almost not worth making. To computers, content and data, and indeed code, are just streams of bits. To my mind, this perspective is important and liberating, and I'd like to explain why. Too often, publishers insist on distinguishing between content and data. So let me give you an anecdote. Several years ago, and I should emphasize this is several years ago, I'm sure things have moved on, but I was running at that time the online business of Nature, and I was having a discussion with a senior editor there about the so-called supplementary information data files that we were publishing alongside the research articles. And I made the point that supplementary information really is the wrong term, because in many cases, the data sets were as important, perhaps more important than the text and figures of the papers themselves. And I went on to ask him about the process of peer reviewing that data. And he looked at me blankly. To cut a long story short, not only were we not peer reviewing that data, but the editor wasn't even opening them before sending them on to the production staff, because, to quote him, I don't know how to. That discrepancy is stark. Research is becoming more digital and more data-driven. Data files are often the most important outputs from individual pieces of research, and even the top journals treat them as an add-on, an optional extra, and even an annoyance. Some even take highly structured data files, I've seen this myself, and turn them into PDFs. That puts us firmly in the information destruction business. When I later went on to establish digital science, which was a software and data business that grew out of Nature, one of the things that caught me by surprise, though given what I've just said, perhaps it shouldn't have done, was the level of interest and the demand among publishers for our, at that time, new data hosting platform, Figshare. At the beginning, I'd thought of Figshare as a data repository for researchers and institutions, but we kept getting calls from publishers who were desperate for someone to take off their hands the sort of unfamiliar and bothersome job of processing and hosting data sets. I'm no longer associated with digital science, but I hope and believe that Figshare and other services like it are an important and useful contribution to the scholarly publishing ecosystem. But the fact that publishers as a whole are so keen to outsource this work, and the fact that we've ended up with this kind of informational apartheid, with content sitting in one place and data sitting in another place, I think is evidence of a really important shortcoming in the industry. The fact that publishers consider content and data to be two different things creates huge blind spots in their views of what knowledge dissemination should look like in the age of the web. So I've been given the opportunity to think about this some more in setting up my new business. It's an education data analytics company called SchoolDash. We're certainly not an academic publisher. We certainly wouldn't describe ourselves that way in any case. But in a sense we are, because we publish research, but we don't publish it in journals. And so we're free to use any format that serves our purposes. And this led us, I think, to use data differently, really deeply embedding it in everything we do, and using it in a way that makes the distinction between content and data, I think, all but meaningless. Let me show you, if we can switch to the browser, I'm going to try and show you a very quick example from our website. So this is a piece of research that we published. In some ways, you can look at it and it will look like a bit like a traditional research paper. It's got figures and all this kind of stuff. And this happens to be about provision of schooling for poorer pupils and their incidence in different types of schools. But we're really keen to enable readers to explore the data themselves. So you know, the figures are interactive. You can look at different types of schools yourself. In this, I'm not going to try and describe what this figure shows, but it's somewhat controversial whether you should include selective grammar schools or not. So we allow people to adjust things and look at things in a different way. So this is an exploratory tool and a research tool in its own right, not just a publication. You saw near the top we have some maps as well. These are static images, but if you click through, you can go to an interactive version of the map. This again is looking at incidence of poorer pupils around the country. One of their characteristics is that they tend to be in urban areas which are geographically small but contain lots of pupils. So this is a bit misleading. This would suggest that the dark red areas are not, where there's high incidence of poverty, are not particularly problematic. So you might want to look at it as a cartogram which rescales each area according to the number of children in that area. And that shows you actually that urban poverty is quite a significant problem in the country, not a small problem. You can also, look at different areas. You can drill into different areas. You can even overlay individual schools on the map if you want to. It takes a few seconds to come up because there's a lot of data. This is useful for kind of looking at overall statistics. It's not particularly useful for looking at individual schools. So we actually just earlier this week we launched something called Explorer, which is a Google Maps mashup that allows you to go to individual areas. If it will come up, what's it doing? Or not, as the case may be. This is what happens with a live demo. This is the Google Maps mashup that allows you to look at individual schools and interact also with a database, which I'm going to have to demo in a slightly different way, that contains information about every school in the country. So you can go from the map to the information about the schools in that area. So that was like a 1-minute tour of a year's worth of work. But what I'm trying to demonstrate here is that we've gone on a journey here from something that looks a lot like a traditional publication, research paper, via interactive figures, mashups, to school profiles, which look very much like a database. So is SchoolDash a publication or a database? It's both, but the distinction is a pointless one in my view. All we want for it to be is useful. And I should add that all the technology we use is freely available and mainstream. If you know how to create web pages, then you know how to use this technology and this software. It means that almost every organisation represented in this room has people that know how to do this stuff. And that means, I think, that if you're not doing it, you're doing it through choice, not necessity. I should also acknowledge that this kind of publishing creates practical challenges. For example, how do you effectively archive interactive content? How do you cater for readers who would rather print it out on paper before reading it? But those issues are eminently solvable. I'm not going to go into them now. We can discuss them afterwards if you want. And this kind of approach also provides answers to other persistent problems, like why should anyone go to your website for the PDF when they can get it more easily and more cheaply elsewhere? At the beginning, I briefly mentioned the idea that code is also content, not just data. And here's an example, if I can find it, here's an example of what I'm talking about. This is, if you like, an online textbook, although you'd put air quotes around textbook because it's effectively an interactive website. And let me see if I've got the right one here. So, of course, it includes code examples. For non-geeks in the room, this will mean nothing, but that's fine. But the really interesting thing about this is this code is all editable. I can, so it has example code, but I can play around with it, and I can run it in the browser. In this case, it's actually a little physics model that runs a little simulation. This is it's an artificial intelligence programming language, and then you can program the computer to try and work out, based on where the ball ends up, where it might have started, right? And then it runs some stats on that if you want to do it. But the details don't matter. The point is that whether this is a website or a book depends on your perspective, but it's ultimately immaterial. And even though this particular site/publication is still under development, it's already among the best conceived programming references I've ever seen, and I've seen quite a lot. Let me finish with one final thought. I'm trying to keep this brief. If data can be content, then the reverse is also true. Content can be data. You all sit on huge databases that you think of as publications, right? Finished, polished products that you think of lying at the end of the value chain, if you like. But to other people, notably programmers and text miners, they're just raw data that they would love to use. And I think you should help them to do so. If we just think back to the SchoolDash Explorer example that I wasn't adequately able to show you, the Google mashup, that effectively is a joint publishing initiative between Google and SchoolDash, my business. But we've never spoken to anyone at Google about it. We've made their maps more useful by combining it with schools' data. And of course, they've enabled us to provide functionality that we would never be able to develop ourselves. Everyone's a winner, and it was made possible because they have a public API, an application programming interface. There are people itching to get their hands on your content, your data, in similar ways, but it's mostly impossible to do. And I think this is a travesty. This is something that's been going on in the industry for many years. They could make, they could make the information that you hold more useful and more valuable in ways that you've never dreamed of. And yes, it's a bit of work to make it happen, but not much. There are really two big reasons, I think, why publishers don't do it. One is that they're reluctant to see their polished content as someone else's raw data. But you already do this with Google, and it's a fact of life, so I think we just need to get over it. Another is that the outcomes are unpredictable. Who knows what products or businesses people might build off this? But I think that's precisely the reason to do it. We should be creating a future with more possibilities, not fewer possibilities, and we should therefore be creating more unpredictability, not less. Embracing the unknown is the way to stay successful in the modern digital era, and above all, the way to stay relevant. In my view, successful publishers of the future will look back and laugh at the thought that text and images were once treated separately from numbers and calculations. They're all the same thing, information, and information is our trade. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Timo. The format now moving forward is going to be Q&A with a panel discussion. I'll kick it off. I think that there are some microphones around the room. And I'm going to kick it off, actually, picking up on one of the themes around startups. And I'd like to ask how established publishing companies can work with startups and what they stand to gain from it. I think I'll start with Timo.
Thank you. Is this on? Can everyone hear me okay? Yeah, so, and Dietmar mentioned this in his presentation as well about newspapers working with startup and acquiring startup companies. it was a really important part of the strategy we had at Digital Science when I was running that business. We effectively built that business by investing in and acquiring mostly very young, very early stage startup businesses. And I find it interesting. I think there's not enough of that going on in the industry. We do see some of the big publishers making acquisitions. Elsevier's got a long history of making acquisitions of companies, but at a much later stage than we would typically invest in at Digital Science, or certainly when I was running it. You see, recently, very interestingly, Wiley buying Atipon is another interesting example of a established publisher investing in and acquiring technical talent. But I think we can do more, and I think there's an element of kind of friction between the startup world and the established publishing world that's unfortunate, because I think they have a lot to gain from one another. There's a sort of mindset among the startups, which is sort of a little bit dismissive of established publishers, that they're old and kind of boring and they're dinosaurs. Which actually, kind of reminds me a little bit, speaking from personal experience, of my own experience with my kids, right? They see me as kind of, old and boring and fat and, and all that sort of stuff. And the startups have, but of course, established businesses have cash flow. They have established businesses. They have, established commercial relationships. They have a place in the world where they're adding value, right? That's why they're in business and why they've been successful. At the same time, the startups, though, the established businesses tend to see the startups as being a little bit kind of, not just startups but upstarts, if you like. That they're that they talk a good talk, but they don't have any, they don't have any business model yet. Many of them don't even have a product yet, right? So what are you talking about? And yet, I think we can learn a lot from them, just as I learned from my kids, right? My 6-year-old, because she's bilingual, still corrects my Japanese, which is really annoying, right? But she's much better than me because she's learned it from when she was a baby, and I didn't. So we, I think each can learn from the other, and I think that was really the experience I had at Digital Science, where you need the kind of the positive attitude, the unbridled, perhaps irrational optimism that you get within startups, the tech savviness, the willingness to take risks because you've got nothing to lose when you're a startup. But you need also the kind of the deep reach, customer relationships, content, and let's face it, money that the established businesses have as well. And I think the combinations can be incredibly powerful, and we don't see enough of that. There's too much kind of startups versus established businesses, rather than how can the two domains work with one another to create something really useful and successful.
Thanks. Dietmar.
Yeah, I agree completely with Timo. The main issue in the publishing area is that basically many publishing houses, when they acquire a new company or a little company, they try to assimilate it and put it in their own structures, which is usually the death sentence. Because long decision making, many people try to influence decisions. Everyone wants to be part of every decision is just poison for every startup. So the cultural aspects of bringing startups and established businesses together is the main challenge. There's some do it better, and some completely fail, and then basically blame it to the startups. That's the funny thing, that now the startup was crap. No, it was because the old structure just took over and played Borg and assimilated the whole culture. So there's no recipe apart from having a manager in the established business who understands the dynamic and understands where the borders are, where you can support the startup and where you have to leave them alone. But we have seen also many startups where the young guns, so 2021, really believe that they can rule the world without experience. And so then the cultural clash is programmed. But it's at the same time good fun.
I just wanted to add also, there's just anecdotally, there's the best document I've ever seen for describing what a big company feels like to a startup was actually written for a completely different purpose. It was a recently declassified manual from the predecessor of the CIA. I can't remember what the name of the organization was then, around the time of the Second World War, which talked about how to sabotage enemy organizations, right? And it talked about, like, if in doubt, set up a committee, always question the probity of certain decisions and whether or not we have the authority to make them, and so it's basically a list of about, 20 items of, from a startup perspective, this is how big companies operate, right? So you need to, I think, as I said, startups need to learn from big companies as well. They have a lot to learn from them, but equally, I think startup companies need to appreciate the perspective of established companies need to appreciate the perspective of startups. And if you're corporate process feels to the startup like enemy sabotage, then there's probably something wrong with it, right?
One other point just to make is, it's intractable and it is a cultural clash. And actually, I think digital science was one of the best experiments in bringing both things together, the scale and the solidness of nature with that kind of unpredictable uncertainty and energy of the startups. It worked very, very well. I've seen Ingram do it nicely as well, Airbook to Aereo. But one thing that I know I've done successfully in the past as well is a small pilot. So just try one project and you almost ring fence the risk. And that seems to make it more palatable to senior management somehow. I think one thing that startups have really suffered with, and I really appreciate this now from my perspective, I didn't so much appreciate it at the time, is the way that publishers guard their content. And I think that's a really difficult question because you are custodians of your content. That, if you don't have that, what do you have? But obviously that is what the startup needs. So finding authors or societies or people who are happy to sort of take that risk and try something new and embrace Timo's philosophy that we need to create a world with more possibilities, and that means more uncertainty. If you can find that and have a proof of concept, then you might have a fighting chance of then integrating that into your business.
Thank you. Lynn?
Yeah, I'd say that a big challenge for publishers is that many of the sort of emerging market opportunities are very much cross-publisher, and I think it's really difficult for publishers to compete with all those niche startups with cross-publisher offerings. That's really, really difficult for them. And, when you look at things like the 101 innovations in scholarly communication, I think it's like 400 innovations, tech startups, and, it's growing. So that is really hard for publishers basically to sort of focus on. So, which is why when I sort of go back to my talk, I mentioned about publishers really thinking about their unique and specific opportunities and thinking about the verticals that they could dig into in terms of their content and the services that they can develop and partner with around that content, rather than competing with some of the startups on sort of cross-publisher initiatives.
Yeah, so for us, it's a case of something Alison mentioned in her talk, actually, recognizing your core competency and where you think others have expertise, partnering there. So we have, over the last few months, partnered with 3 or 4 startups with very, not very small, but very well-defined projects which have minimal risk for us, but it allows us to ascertain the utility of the technology, and of course if it's very successful then they go onto our acquisition list. No, we try to approach this with the spirit of collaboration and a small, well-defined project, and so far, early days, but it seems to be working well.
Fantastic, thanks everyone. Have we got any questions from the floor, please? None. Okay, well, I've got a couple more. Was there one over there? Great.
I'm thinking about the startup thing, if you don't mind me just saying something. I really believe in startups. I mean, I'm very interested in what Timo was saying, and I'm very excited by the ideas he put forward, because I've been holding them for years, so it's a different thing. But the thing is, I see startups all the time. Even some of them are even sent to me, okay? Amazingly. But they come and they go. They come, and some of them do well. Most of them sell out, and it's a matter of choosing when they're going to sell out is very important. Some sell out early, some sell out later, and their people go away very wealthy, the top people anyhow. But the publishers are going on, and although they're wrong in so many ways, and not taking advantage of the market changes, their revenues and profits are there, as somebody pointed out. They're there, and there's a certain feeling, I think, in publishing circles, but I may be wrong because I'm out of touch to a large extent, is that, look, at the moment, we're doing quite well, actually, and although we've got things to do, we do know what we're doing, and we know perhaps that some startups are very useful, and we want to work with them, but we're not stupid, you know?
Yeah, so I understand, I agree with a lot of that. I think it depends critically on a couple of things. Right? One is what your time horizons are. Yeah, so how far ahead are you looking? If you're looking in the next 2 or 3 years, you shouldn't be discussing innovation and inventiveness and startups and all that stuff because it won't make any difference on that kind of timescale. If you're looking 5 or 10 or 15 years in the future, then I think it will. Now, but it also depends on what your view of the future is, right? So if you believe the future looks a lot like the present, then it's going to make less difference, right? So I think those of us who advocate working with startups and embracing innovation and all of that kind of stuff, realistically do it because it interests us. That's certainly speaking for myself. That's what gets me fired up. But also it's because we really believe that the future is going to look rather different from today, and that we're thinking on those sorts of time horizons where where that change will come about, and that what that means is that you need to develop new capabilities and new skills. Right? It's not enough to rest on your laurels. We often forget that our businesses were built on innovators of the past, right? It's not like publishing or even journals have been around forever, right? The people that originally created them were innovators, right? The founders of Nature were, and the publishers at Macmillan, the Macmillan brothers, when they set it up, were innovators, right? They were trying something very new, and it lost money for years in the early years, right? So it was a startup once upon a time. Right? All of our businesses were once startups. And the question is, I think the question we should be saying is, not only do we how do we build on the legacy that we've inherited, and how do we continue that, but how can we create new franchises for the future, right? What are the new things that we're going to be doing? But you do have to believe that the future in some way is going to look different from the past, because if it's not, then sure, you should stick with what you're doing. I think that's the highest risk strategy of all, but it depends on your view of the future.
Yeah.
Sure. Well, there's also the issue of there's hundreds of startups, and if you're going to you're not going to work with all of them. And Anthony, you correctly said you said most of them sell out. Actually, most of them fail. The vast majority of them fail in all domains, not just in this domain. And some of them succeed. So you have to take your pick. I mean, at Digital Science, during my time, we invested in 10 companies, of which 8 have succeeded. Right. So 2 fell by the wayside. We probably looked at 300 companies in making those investments, right? So you have to be discerning, and then you have to create an environment, whatever that is, in which that kind of young, vulnerable but company full of potential can thrive, right? Those are not trivial things to do. I'm not trying to pretend they're easy. They were really bloody hard, because I've got personal experience of that. But I think you can do it, and I think people should be doing it.
Maybe. I mean, here where the clash comes in, the cultural clash, because as soon as a CFO from the established company turns up and wants to have, after 3 months already, results, and of course positive results, then this is a culture that with startups doesn't work. And I don't know the percentage, but I guess it's 0.1% of startups that succeed, possibly, it's a random number now. And this this allowing an organization to experiment, but also allowing to fail, is something where publishers, at least the news publishers we work with, have big difficulties. There is no room for failing. There is no room for experimentation. It's all about short-term success, and this is then, of course, working against experimenting with startups.
I think maybe implicit in what you were saying as well, Anthony, was the anxiety that publishers feel, is this a good bet? Is this startup just going to go down and take everything with it? And I just wonder if that isn't the wrong question. I mean, it's valid, but actually I wonder if the biggest advantage that publishers get from working with startups isn't the code, because frankly, you can replicate code. It's the energy, it's the ideas, it's the ability to try something out and see how it lands in your market. And if the startup's more likely to go down, clearly, if nobody's collaborating with them, and I think that's actually part of the reason behind a lot of publishing startups' failure, is the inability of the publishing industry to engage with them. But if that startup goes down, but the idea was good, then you can take that forward.
Can I just say quickly, Timo is right. A lot of the things in the past were kept going for years Journal of Material Science. For 10 years it didn't make any money. Journal of Molecular Biology, another one I was associated with. That made no money for 10 years. And I don't know why we're probably losing on this. I don't know, we're probably losing our nerve or something.
Yeah. At the moment, it's like, I can see in the industry we have the syndrome where the frog is slowly boiled in the water. And what you said, oh, we are doing quite well. I don't know how many times I heard this from my clients. And then I look at the numbers and they said, okay, hang on, 15 years ago you had a margin of 35%. So news publishers learned shed loads of money. And now they basically bring the champagne out if they have 10%. But they still say, oh, actually we are doing quite well. So it's all a matter of perspective. And let's see how it is in 5 years. I predict that many of the newspaper publishers won't make it over the next 5-10 years because the change accelerates. It doesn't slow down, and it will become more and more. Yeah, it will become faster.
I'm interested in expanding on that further. You brought up in your presentation in terms of how the mass market influences the niche. And I think that's a very, very important point that you made. I'd like to put that to the panel. We have other content sectors which are slightly ahead of us in terms of the change that they appear to have gone through, but we appear within our niche in some instances unable to actually address absolute parallels within our own sectors.
I mean, it all starts with the customer behavior. And this is also what the news industry had to learn to understand, that the editor doesn't sit in a high tower and speaks to the people and distributes his wisdom. So this kind of attitude had to change, and there are still many editors out there who still believe actually they are the authority of everything. And but as soon as news publishers start listening and looking at the audience, not researching them. These are two different things. Researching and understanding are two different things. This empathy for audience is something that is important, and not asking them, what do you want to have in this publication? You will never get the right answer. Otherwise, there would be only cultural websites and no porn. So it's quite simple. People will never tell what they actually want and what they're interested in. You have to learn and understand them. And this is where the many news publishers now slowly and use data, especially data, but also talking to people. It's also a new discipline for a publisher to actually talk to the customer. It's also not very common. And to understand how they use content, the use cases, on which devices, on what times of the day, and the special research. When I did my PhD, it's 15 years ago, there was no iPhone. There was no, yes, we had websites, yes, but I spent I don't know how many days in libraries running through paper magazines. So I'm not sure, but I guess if I did now another one, I would also spend a lot of time running through paper, because most of the material back then didn't exist digitally. And I'm suspect that a lot of now also only exists on paper. But the world has changed. I mean, digital, when you need an piece of information, you get it here. And I think this is a big chance for any publisher, of academic or whatever, to use this here. That's the biggest education instrument we have ever had. And it makes it easy, fast, and actually quite cheap, because the cost to produce anything for digital is practically zero.
Can I just add to that? I mean, I just want to also, going back to your point, Jon, I'm not sure if this is what you intended, but in terms of how the mainstream influences the niche, one of the things I want to say is that for me, the kind of the ideas and the concepts that came out of mainstream spaces were what informed us, certainly the whole time I was working at Nature and Digital Science. The companies we worked with, the startup companies, were in our niche, if you like, but the ideas, the new technologies, the new approaches that were influencing us were coming from, the wider world, and particularly from, the west coast of the US and other places like that, where there was this sort of hub of creativity and lots of technologists. I would spend a lot of time in California at conferences, not publishing conferences, but technology conferences, talking with technologists. And these weren't people we were going to work with, because frankly we couldn't afford to invest in their companies, but they had really smart ideas. They were several years ahead of the curve, and we could take some of those ideas. I mean, basically, I could take those ideas back to London. I could get credit for saying, hey, here's a good idea. We could implement this in science publishing, because there are other domains that are ahead of us. I think there's another really important way in which the mainstream influences the niche, and Dietmar alluded to this, which is, our customers and our readers and our authors all use new devices and new technologies in their personal lives, right? So, one of the founding kind of observations for digital science was that, scientists, at home, they've got like amazing devices and software for organizing their music and their photos, right? When they go into the lab, how do they organize their data or the assets in their lab, right? They don't have good tools for doing that. And we wanted to fix that problem. And so the expectations of the people that we serve are changing rapidly over time, right? I mean, you think about how young the iPhone is, right? The iPhone's only about 10 years old or something, right? So, and we just take it for granted now, right, that we have these devices. So the world is changing around us. However much our industry changes, the world is changing, and the people that we serve are experiencing those changes in the other parts of their lives, and their expectations of us will change as a result of that.
I think also a part of the problem is we're insulated from our users by the people who purchase the services. So we don't sell our content to the end users, we sell to librarians. So sometimes the world can be changing around us, and perhaps the librarians are slower to respond to that. So while all the students are out there searching for journals on their iPhone, perhaps there's a perception from the publisher and the library where the transaction takes place that the desktop is still the place to be. So I think the fact that we are insulated from the end user is even more important for publishers to speak to the end users.
Thanks.
John, there's someone over there.
Yeah.
Please.
Yeah, sorry. Hi, Tim. Pablo from Elsevier. I would like to ask you, based on your experience, your startup experience, what do you think should be the right balance between, what should be the right balance in the relation and structure between the startup and the main publisher, and the main publisher with the startup, so that the collaboration can work well?
Was that directed at me? I think there are other
Yeah.
start-up-y people here, but I'm happy to try and address that. That's a really difficult question to answer because it's different for every situation, right? I'll make some broad comments, and then if you want to catch me afterwards, we can have a more in-depth discussion. You have to take into account the stage of the startup, right? There's very, very early stage startups, don't even have a product yet, may not, certainly unlikely to be selling anything yet, so have no revenue, and in many cases, particularly in this domain, they will be first-time entrepreneurs as well, where you really need to kind of take a nurturing approach. I think very hands-on. So they'll have certain skills and talents, but they'll need a lot of help in being able to set up their team and set up a business, just the nuts and bolts of it, right? So you almost consider it like to be a little business nursery, right, where you're bringing up these companies that are very young and really just in their very early formative years. There are other, but if you invest in a more established business, maybe it's already got quite strong cash flow, but it wants to go global, for example. It just has a domestic business. That's a different prospect. Then you can leave them to get on with the product development and so forth. And what you're really trying to do is help them build an overseas sales team, for example, that kind of thing. So it does vary a lot according to the circumstances. But I would say that I think one of the most important things is, well, a couple of things. One is just really having people who work with them who understand startups, ideally who have some experience with startups. So again, harking back to my digital science experience, we had people who had worked at and for startup businesses who weren't particularly necessarily experienced in the publishing industry, right? So that was less important for us actually than that they knew how to work with startups. So having people who know what that's about and preferably have some experience of it is really important, because it is a very different experience being in a startup company than being in an established company. It's a completely different experience, a different world. The other thing is to create, to try and, I don't like this word, but to create synergies, right? To try and create an environment in which that business can collaborate either with the established business or with other startups that you may be working with, right? It's very important to create, not just to treat them in isolation. You know, you've got this product or this service they're trying to develop, and thinking very hard about what are the complementarities elsewhere in the business, either with other startups we're working with or with our core business, and really helping them nurture that without getting them involved in all the internal kind of bureaucracy and politics. You have to keep them well away from that. And so really trying to, you know, where's the connection point? Could they get access to the content, or can they get access to customers, or whatever it is, right? How can we most help them, but without any of the baggage that usually brings if you're doing it typically within a large company? I mean, those are a few observations. I could go on about that all day, so I'll stop there.
So, maybe one sentence. What Axel Springer does, for example, they take quite senior people. So, for example, the editor-in-chief of Die Welt basically, and he took a little team and then worked with a startup group outside the building and outside the P&L on new products. So there is this connection, you said, you know, back to the old organization. When they need something, the senior person actually is respected enough to get it also. So this works very well there. But again, as Timo said, every case is different.
I think the one point that I would add is that startups are much more in the game of actually coming up with more kind of low-cost prototype services, and maybe, you know, that's something that the bigger publishers need to think about, that actually you don't need to invest, you know, a whole lot of money and effort into something. You just need to get something up there and running, and then tune in to how the customer is reacting to that, and then be flexible and agile enough to develop and just keep close to the market as to how that shapes up.
I think we at Emerald are quite unusual in that we have an innovation and user testing team who run sprints throughout the organization, which last for 5 days, and they're given a specific publishing task or problem to solve, and their time is ring-fenced. You know, they have the whole 5 days to come up with a solution and present back to the company. And that kind of spirit of innovation allows us to become a little bit more flexible when we're working with startups. So we also then recognize what their core competencies are as well as ours.
Yeah, I think the Emerald approach to innovation is brilliant, and I know there's an article about your sprint process, isn't there? And I really encourage you to Google that. It's great. I think just one tiny point to add is it's something about the power balance, I guess, between the two. I have seen, and I suspect I might have done in the past, that thing of talking to a startup only with the intention of getting ideas and finding out what they're doing. And I think that's a really unfair way for publishers to use up startups' time. So I think that it's just something to bear in mind. You know, startups need traction, they need stuff from you, so it is a two-way street, and I think publishers need to respect the startups just as much as the startups, the publishers.
Thanks. I think we've got a question over here.
Hi, Timo, it's Nico Goncharoff, Digital Science. Timo, last time you were up on that stage, I asked a similar question, so my apologies. I thought it would be interesting to get a bit more specific. We're talking about publishers' core competencies, and we're talking about a lot of generalities. But if I'm a publisher sitting in the room, and I'm not, I might want to know what suggestions you have in terms of what type of startup should we be investing in, what business case should we be solving? Because one of the things that I think has characterized failed startups is a publishing company either invests in it without knowing clearly why they're doing so, or they're investing in it to achieve a goal that's fundamentally unattainable, like developing a platform that every researcher in the world will come to no matter what, because that's never ever going to happen. If it were me, I would invest in technologies that allow me to disseminate my content widely into every workflow and be able to track it, be able to have some data over how it's used. But I'd love to hear from the panel what suggestions you have for specific use cases or value propositions that publishers could look to in terms of working with startups.
Do you want me to start again? All right, so hi Nico. So Nico, obviously a former colleague of mine from Digital Science, and one of our entrepreneurs. So you could, if you want to know what it's like to be a startup entrepreneur in this space, you should go and speak with Nico. You know, well, I would, given what I was talking about earlier, I would offer capabilities with with data as being a particular area, actually. I think that's a kind of area where, notwithstanding some of the comments I made about the technology being straightforward, I think we do need new ideas and approaches, and I think it's a great area for working with startups who have, who are unencumbered by the baggage of the way that things have been done in the past. But I think fundamentally what you need to do is to think about, what your what are the things that are most relevant to your business? I mean, there's publishers come in such a wide variety of shapes and sizes that it's impossible to sort of give a one-size-fits-all. But if you're in a particular area, I mean, Nico did a lot of work in organic chemistry data, for example, right, which was incredibly interesting and powerful. If that's your bag, then there's people doing amazing stuff in that area, and I encourage you to work with them. But it's not going to be relevant to every publisher, right? If you're in other domains, if you're a very big publisher, you might be thinking about creating industry-wide platforms, huge systems that everyone can use. But if you're a niche publisher, you want to think about smaller scales. How can you serve your particular community? So it's really hard to give a general answer to that question. I think you first of all have to ask yourself, what is it that you see as your core mission? What value are you delivering? And then who has an interesting new spin on being able to do that, right? Whether it's something in chemistry or whether it's something in another domain, or whether it's a particular type of interaction. But going back to what I said earlier on, I would offer data capabilities as something that I think everyone should be interested in one way or another.
Yeah, completely agree. Data and everything that has to do with engagement, how to get new ways to engage with people, because the audience or our customers are overwhelmed with information and data and everything. So the engagement to keep them stuck with the publication or with the brand, whatever, is something. If there's something new out there that works, if it's either technology or other things or platforms, this is something where I would look at. Same with everything that is understanding the customer better. This is also a big gap and it will become core competence. So it is a core competence, actually, understanding what the audience or what the customer wants. So this is something to look into.
Yeah, I mean, I would say it's about defining what makes you unique and special, and how you can build on that. And that's where then you choose to sort of buy or build and work with tech startups. And so it's building on all the great attributes that you've already got and coming up with a strategy, whether that's buy or build. But it's really about recognizing your own kind of unique position, I think, and how you build up from there.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things I was pleasantly surprised about was Emerald has a reputation as being a business and management research publisher. However, we publish quite a lot of stuff in other fields like engineering and social care and things like that. So when we did this mass interview of our users, it was interesting to see the kind of things they valued from us. So as I alluded to in my talk, the nuts and bolts of publishing articles seems to be a solved problem. We can optimize it, we can reduce the time for peer review and publication, but the process is perhaps less interesting than the services around that. And in addition to services around it, there was a feeling that the users want to speak to each other. They want some form of community engagement. I don't think that's necessarily the case with all publishers. Emerald seems to have a kind of a warm and fuzzy reputation. So there was this sense that, yes, the content is very interesting, but we want to do more. We want to speak to each other. We want to share it. We want to reuse it in interesting ways, audio summaries even. So I think if you have a service or a feature which somehow promotes community aspects or is a valuable service to a niche content type, then that's the kind of things we are looking at anyway.
And I suppose to take it from a slightly different angle, not looking at any particular field as a sort of ripe for startup, but any startup that has come from a person who is one of your target users or readers, or somebody in your field who's solving a problem in that field, I think is probably always a good bet as well, because a startup that does something because it can is probably going to be less effective than a startup that has been born out of a real need. And I'm thinking particularly of Figshare there, actually, Timo, Mark's story about just the issues that he faced managing his data. That's a real need. A solution was created to, and therefore that need's probably going to be shared by other people. So if you know who the people that you serve are, and you're in communication with them, you're going to be putting yourself in a very good position to find out the solutions that they are creating for themselves, which is a very, very good place to start your innovation strategy.
Sorry to take a second bite of the cherry, but just to add really quickly two things. I mean, two things that are really central to scholarly publishing: peer review, and content discovery. Right? There's loads of people who are trying to make both of those things better. Lots of people have tried in various ways and have failed, but there are lots of people still trying to make them better, and some of them I know are at this event, right? So those are two things that are relevant to everyone, right? And two things that are so core to our business that if you find anyone who you think is doing something truly interesting and relevant in those areas, you should consider working with them and supporting them.
Thanks. I think we had another question in the middle here before the last one. No. Any others?
Oh, hello, I'll just ask a very general question, crystal ball wise. Oh, I'm over here for blinded people. You mentioned earlier, it depends what your vision of the future looks like. So I'd like to hear from the panel what their visions of the future are. Just a quick one.
Okay, I can lean back.
We start at that end.
Oh, good. Okay, I'll set the bar nice and low for you guys.
In terms of scholarly publishing, so I do think that we, there's all sorts of visions of the future we might have in it. But in terms of scholarly publishing, I do think we're going to see. I think we're going to see more and more openly available content for whatever reason. I think we're seeing that, and I think one of the things we should be thinking about is then what can we do? What value can we add on top of huge corpuses of openly available, open access content? Lots of people are thinking about that, but I think perhaps not enough publishers are doing it. I think it's going to seem more and more anachronistic to have individual publishers or societies representing particular slices of research, right, particular domains, when more and more we're trying to break down the boundaries between those domains. So I think societies in particular need to ask themselves if they're part of the problem or part of the solution when it comes to interdisciplinary research. We're going to see, particularly in the life sciences, but also elsewhere, we're going to see bigger and bigger research teams, more global, more data-driven, collaborating online, all of that stuff. So more kind of industrial scale research. And I think there's big questions about how we disseminate that kind of information. I think not everyone will agree with me, and certainly not everyone will like this. I think we're going to see fewer, bigger publishers on average, and we're going to see increasing consolidation in the industry, among many, many, many other things, but those are a few random thoughts.
Yeah, it's difficult now because I'm not a scholar publisher. So, but for the news media industry, how I see how they could grow again is basically learning from niche. So becoming a collection of different niche products, and not on purpose I don't say publishing products, but it's more about understanding what the interests are in the life of the audience and then building a world around it. And this is a print publication, this is an app, this is an event, this is other products, e-commerce. So everything that is important for the audience to create this environment where it's a one-stop shop. There are examples, very successful examples in America, who understood that the content is only valuable when it is part of a bigger thing, and not just a magazine or a website. And this is where hopefully some of the publishers will go, and some do it already.
I just have one sort of thought, which is really around that kind of knowledge mobilization area, and thinking more about how we apply more the sort of research through to the policy and the practice. And I think that is going to gain more momentum. And really interesting talk this morning about higher education and getting students in universities to actually sort of become more involved in the journal process, and how thinking about how we might engage more with them in that's certainly an area I think that could be very interesting.
I'm thinking particularly about education and end users here. So I think there will be a growing need for publishers to not just look at research articles, but to be a almost lifelong partner through education, from high school to being CEO, and to be that kind of trusted partner, as I say, on their education journey. The other thing is the end user. We've alluded to the fact that publishers are somewhat removed from the end user. I think also economically, publishers rely far too much on their large institutional subscriptions, when in fact there are almost a whole world out there of people who could be interested in your material but have no way to access it. So yeah, education and end users.
Yeah. Well, I'm not going to disagree with any of that. And another thought that occurs to me is that I think the future for publishers will be more diverse in terms of revenue generation than it is now. I'd suggest that if you're still relying entirely on selling content for money as your single revenue stream, you might want to think about diversifying. And I think that there will be strands of revenue. I think that services will become more and more important. And actually, this is a really interesting and positive thing for publishers in a sense. You know, that the world runs on content, but not static content anymore. It's interesting, you know, Timo demonstrating those figures. That's why you'd come to a publisher, because you can do something interesting with it. So I think that there are multiple opportunities for publishers to find sources of funding, sources of revenue, you know, serve their clients, make that content more useful and applicable to them, consulting and so on. I think there's going to be many, many different ways for publishers to earn money, but I think it's going to be not just that solo strand of selling your content for cash.
Thanks. We've come to the end of the session now. Thanks very much to everyone for attending, and thanks very much indeed to all our panellists.